Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight, we bring you a reimagined tale of despair and revelation. Old Bugs by H.P. Lovecraft. This is not a simple retelling, it's a suspenseful, recrafted narration, reshaped to captivate modern ears while preserving the haunting spirit of the original.
Sheehan's pool room crouched in a forgotten alley of Chicago's Stockyard district, a den where daylight rarely dared intrude. The air was a choking fog of smoke and sour breath, heavy with the stench of cheap cigars and cigarettes clinging to the lips of men who seemed more beast than human. Yet the place thrived, its popularity undiminished, for beneath the haze lurked a secret lure. Rising above the foul mix of odors was a forbidden perfume, the sharp, intoxicating bite of whiskey, outlawed yet flowing freely here, like contraband nectar for the damned. Sheehan's was no ordinary dive. It was the beating heart of Chicago's underground trade in liquor and narcotics, a place where even the filth carried a strange dignity. But one figure stood apart, stripped of all dignity, a ghost among the shadows. They called him Old Bugs. He was the most pitiful wreck in a room full of wrecks, gaunt, ragged, and broken. No one knew his past, though whispers spread whenever his drunken tongue slipped into strange, lofty words, fragments of poetry and prose that hinted at a life once touched by brilliance. What he had become, however, was plain to see: a shambling servant of vice, a down-and-outer in the truest sense. Legend said he had stormed into Sheehan's one night, raving for whiskey and hashish, frothing like a mad prophet. In exchange for odd jobs, mopping floors, scrubbing glasses, tending to the filth no one else would touch, he was granted the poisons that kept his body moving and his mind from shattering. Most nights he muttered in the gutter's tongue, but when the liquor burned hot in his veins, he would erupt into strange torrents of language, grand, sonorous, and utterly out of place in that den of ruin. And in those moments, the regulars would glance at one another uneasily, wondering what tragedy had dragged such a man into the abyss. Among the regulars at Sheehan's was a man hiding from the law, a disgraced banker who, for reasons unknown, often sought out the company of Old Bugs. Their conversations carried a strange weight, and from the old man's peculiar turns of phrase, the patron whispered his theory. This wreck had once been a scholar, perhaps even a professor. The only true relic of Old Bugs's past was a photograph he guarded like treasure. Worn and faded, wrapped in fragile tissue, it revealed the face of a young woman of striking nobility. Her features were refined, her attire decades out of fashion, and her presence seemed utterly alien to the sordid world of Sheehan's. Whenever Old Bugs drew it from his pocket, his ruined face softened, and he would stare for hours with a tenderness that unsettled those who watched.
Old Bugs himself looked like a relic of another age. Towering in height, yet bent by years of defeat, his frame was draped in clothing long out of style. His hair, patchy and white, hung in disarray, while a coarse stubble clung stubbornly to his gaunt face, never shaved, never grown. Once he had been heavy-set, but now his flesh sagged in purple folds beneath bleary eyes, a grotesque testament to years of ruin. Most days he was the archetype of a derelict, ready to trade dignity for a coin or a drink. Yet sometimes, in rare flashes, something stirred within him. His posture would straighten, his eyes would ignite with a forgotten fire, and for a moment he carried himself with a strange grace. The other drunks sensed it too, and in those moments they hesitated to mock him. He would speak then with biting wit, his words sharp and sardonic, leaving the room uneasy, as if they had glimpsed a ghost of the man he once had been. The rare flashes of dignity in old Bugs never lasted long. Soon enough the fire in his eyes would gutter out, and he would sink back into his endless cycle of scrubbing floors and polishing spittoons. Yet there was one habit that set him apart from the other drudges of Sheehan's, a dangerous quirk that made him more than a mere slave to the establishment. Whenever a fresh-faced youth was brought in for his first taste of liquor, old Bugs would erupt. Rising from his knees with sudden fury, he would mutter dire warnings, his voice trembling with rage and desperation. His words spilled out in tangled torrents, grandiose admonitions, strange oaths, and fevered pleas that carried a dreadful sincerity. More than one drug-ravaged patron shivered at the sight, unnerved by the old man's frantic attempts to halt another descent into ruin. But inevitably, the storm would pass. His mind, dulled by alcohol, would wander, and with a foolish grin, he would return to his mop as if nothing had happened.
No one at Sheehan's would ever forget the day young Alfred Trevor arrived. He was a prize catch, a golden-haired youth with wealth, charm, and a reckless spirit that promised excess. Pete Schultz, Sheehan's sly runner, had discovered him at Lawrence College in Appleton, Wisconsin, and quickly marked him as easy prey. Alfred was the son of Carl Trevor, a respected attorney, and Eleanor Wing, a poetess of some renown. He himself was bright, handsome, and spoiled, an eager scholar with a taste for poetry and a dangerous curiosity for forbidden pleasures. At college he had been the life of a mock fraternity, the loudest voice in drunken revels, but childish games no longer satisfied him. He had read of darker vices, and now he longed to experience them firsthand. Perhaps his hunger for indulgence was sharpened by the strict discipline at home. His mother, Eleanor, had raised him with rigid severity, haunted by her own youthful scars. Long ago she had been engaged to a man whose ruin through dissipation had left her permanently marked with horror. And now, unknowingly, her son was walking toward the same abyss. Young Galpin had once been the pride of Appleton, a brilliant mind, celebrated at the University of Wisconsin and at 23 already a professor at Lawrence. He was engaged to the town's most radiant daughter, a future that seemed destined for greatness. But beneath the polished surface, shadows stirred. What began with a single drink in youthful secrecy grew into habits that corroded his promise. The storm broke suddenly. Whispers of scandal forced his resignation, and his engagement collapsed in disgrace. Galpin fled east, chasing redemption, but the pattern repeated. At New York University he fell again, dismissed in shame. Yet his genius refused to die. He poured himself into books and lectures, dazzling audiences with fiery defenses of Villon, Poe, Verlaine, and Wilde, writers whose own lives mirrored his descent. For a brief season, it seemed he might reclaim respect. There was even talk of a renewed engagement in a cultured home on Park Avenue. But then came the final blow, an outrage so devastating that his name was erased from polite society. Galpin vanished, abandoning his identity. Rumors linked him to a Consul Hastings, a scholar dabbling in theater and film, but that figure too dissolved into obscurity. In Appleton, his name became a cautionary tale, whispered by parents to frighten their children away from vice. Eleanor Wing, once his fiancée, married Carl Trevor, a rising lawyer.
She carried only the faint memory of Galpin, enough to shape the strict upbringing of her son, Alfred. Yet, despite her vigilance, Alfred now stood in Sheehan's pool room, golden-haired and reckless, about to lift his first glass. "Boss!" Schultz bellowed as he shoved open the door to Sheehan's foul den, dragging behind him a fresh-faced prize. "This here's Al Trevor, best sport up at Lawrence College, Appleton. Big shot family, too. Father's a corporation lawyer, mother's some kind of literary star. Kid wants to taste life raw, the way it really is. So, treat him right. He's my friend." The names Trevor, Lawrence, Appleton hung in the smoke like sparks. Something shifted in the room. Perhaps it was only the clatter of billiard balls or the rattle of glasses from the back, but more than one patron swore they heard teeth grind, a sharp breath drawn through clenched jaws. The dirty curtains at the lone window stirred as if in warning. Trevor stepped forward with the poise of privilege. "Glad to meet you, Mr. Sheehan," he said smoothly. "This is my first time in a place like this, but I'm a student of life. I don't want to miss any experience. There's poetry in this sort of thing, you know, even if you don't see it." Sheehan's grin was wide and wolfish. "Son, you've come to the right hole. We've got all kinds of life here. Real life, the kind the government can't scrub clean. They can preach virtue all they want, but they can't stop a man from drinking when he's thirsty. So, what'll it be? Whiskey? Coke? Or something stronger? Name it, and it's yours." At that moment, the steady rhythm of a mop against the floor faltered. The silence was brief, but it carried weight. Trevor's eyes gleamed. "Whiskey, good old rye. I'm sick of water. I've read of the wild feasts men used to have, and I want to taste it myself. Every time I read an ode to wine, my mouth waters, and not for water." The regulars blinked at his words, puzzled. "Anachrontic! What the hell's that?" one muttered. But the disguised bank defaulter leaned in, explaining with a sly smile. Anachron was an old poet, lived centuries ago, wrote about wine, women, and song. His world was one big Sheehan's.
"Trevor," the defaulter pressed, "didn't Schultz say your mother dabbles in literature?" "Yes, curse it," Alfred snapped. "But she's no poet of wine and song. She's one of those dreary moralists who drain the joy from life. Eleanor Wing, that's her name. Ever heard of her?" At that moment, the mop slipped from old Bug's hands. Sheehan, grinning broadly, wheeled in a tray laden with bottles and glasses. "Here's your poison, lad. Finest rye in Chicago. Hot enough to burn the soul right out of you." Trevor's eyes gleamed as the fumes rose, sharp and acrid. His stomach recoiled, his inherited delicacy revolted, but his reckless hunger for experience held firm. He lifted the glass, determined to drink. Then chaos erupted. Old Bug sprang from his crouch with startling force. In one motion, he struck the glass from Trevor's hand, then swung his mop like a weapon, smashing bottles and scattering liquor across the floor. The room filled with the stench of spilled whiskey, broken glass glittering like shards of judgment. Some of the patrons dropped to their knees, lapping at the puddles like beasts, while others froze, transfixed by the derelict's frenzy. Straightening, Old Bugs fixed his gaze on the stunned youth. His voice, suddenly calm and cultivated, cut through the haze. "Do not do this. I was like you once. I drank. And now I am this." Trevor's face flushed with rage. "What do you mean, you decrepit fool? How dare you interfere with a gentleman's pleasures?" Sheehan stormed forward, his hand heavy on the old man's shoulder. "That's enough, you wretch. When a man wants a drink here, he gets it. Now get out before I throw you into the street." But Sheehan had underestimated the fire that still smoldered in Old Bugs.
Gripping his mop like a spear, he drove back the crowd, clearing space with wild, furious thrusts. His voice rose in broken fragments of scripture and poetry, echoing through the room. The sons of Belial, swollen with insolence and wine. The room dissolved into chaos. Screams and curses echoed as men recoiled from the frenzy they had unleashed. Trevor, pale and shaken, pressed himself against the wall, his bravado shattered. Through the din, old Bugs roared with a voice that seemed to rise beyond mere words. "He shall not drink! He shall not drink!" The cry reverberated like a curse. Policemen appeared at the doorway, drawn by the uproar, yet hesitated to intervene, watching the madness unfold. Trevor, trembling, edged toward them, his mind racing. If only he could escape, catch a train back to Appleton, he would count his education in vice complete, never again tempted by the lure of forbidden pleasures. Then, abruptly, old Bugs stilled. He straightened, taller and prouder than anyone had ever seen him, his ragged frame momentarily regal. With a voice that rang like a final proclamation, he cried, "Ave Caesar! Morituris te saluto!" And with that, he collapsed upon the whiskey-soaked floor, lifeless. The image seared itself into Trevor's memory, blurred yet unforgettable. The policemen forced their way through the crowd, questioning witnesses, pressing Sheehan for answers. None could explain the derelict's past. Then the bank defaulter spoke up, recalling the photograph old Bugs always carried. Reluctantly, an officer searched the body and drew forth the tissue-wrapped portrait. As it passed from hand to hand, drunken laughter mocked its beauty, but the sober fell silent. The face was delicate, noble, spiritual, utterly out of place in that den of ruin. When the picture reached Trevor, something shifted within him. He stared, startled, then carefully rewrapped the fragile image, shielding it from the filth around him. In that moment, the sordid room seemed to fade, leaving only the haunting connection between the fallen man and the youth who had nearly followed his path. Trevor bent low, studying the lifeless figure sprawled upon the whiskey-soaked floor. In death, the wreck's features seemed to shift, tall, aristocratic, almost noble, as though the ruin of vice had finally released a truer face. When asked about the photograph, Trevor shook his head quickly. "No," he muttered, "I don't know her. The picture is too old. No one could recognize it now." But the words were a lie, and those who watched him suspected as much. His sudden offer to claim the body and arrange its burial in Appleton only deepened the mystery. For Trevor knew the truth. Above the mantel in his family's library hung the same portrait, pristine and honored. He had grown up beneath its gaze, cherishing the gentle, noble features of the woman it depicted. And now, staring at the broken husk called Old Bugs, he realized with horror that the face in the photograph, the face of beauty and dignity, was his own mother's. And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.